The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we are joined by Stephen Schork. Stephen Schork is a highly acclaimed speaker who is widely recognized for his ability to integrate vast arrays of compelling information into dynamic and succinct market views. His presentations include overviews of the most pressing issues affecting the energy sector and context within which to evaluate market action. Now let's get into the episode with Stephen. Welcome back, Dave, John, and Stephen Schork, editor and co-founder at the Schork Group.
Great to be back.
Yep. As always, great to be here.
And looking forward to our second podcast with Stephen as well. It's always enlightening with some of the material he covers.
Okay, well, we're going to focus on future projections. So I'm going to start by reflecting back in the past slightly. And when all the talk was about peak oil, it was the big subject. We don't hear a lot about it now. So my question is, will oil demand peak? That's the first part of the question. And then the cheeky bit, if so, when?
Fair enough. The quick answer is no. So, hey, next question.
Okay, right. Please explain why no.
No. So let's go back to peak oil, the fallacy of it. I had a client, for a hedge fund client, out of a major European trading hub, and he was a short-lived client. And why so? I gave my thesis at the time. This would have been 2008, when oil prices were $120 a barrel, there and about. My thesis was it couldn't stay there, and that we would get a significant downturn in price because by that time the economic writing was on the wall. And he just looked at me, kind of grinned, nodded, and then just took out a book about peak oil, slid it across the desk to me, and said, "This is why oil will never go back below $100 a barrel." And then, of course, 4 months later, oil's at $30 a barrel, and I had a short-lived client. And there was a fallacy of peak oil. And that fallacy was the earth is not running out of oil. When we look at the last 50 years, 150 years of mining oil or coal or so forth, we've barely scratched the surface of the earth. When we take the density of the earth and what the density we've taken of the fossil fuels we've taken out of the ground, literally, we've only scratched the surface of the earth. In fact, mining for rare earths for our environmentally friendly green energy will dwarf what we've seen up to this date with mining oil. So where am I going with this? So we did not have peak oil. We had peak exploration. So when you had oil beginning in the mid-1980s, or for the entire decade of the 80s, that averaged right around $20 a barrel or below, oil prices averaging $20 a barrel in the 1990s, of course, no one was looking for it. And at that time, demand was split, bifurcated. Of course, you had demand growth in the West, in the United States, the go-go 80s of North America, and in Europe. In Japan, of course, everyone was talking about Japan Inc. But what happened in the early 1990s? Well, that was the start of the internet .com boom. So once again, the U.S. economy took off. But that also coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the integration of Eastern Europe into Western Europe, which Western Europe had to absorb. They had to absorb all of that sloth that was coming, for lack of a better term. So that held the European economy back. And then Japan Inc., that bubble burst. So you really only had one demand driver in the 1990s, the United States. Of course, at the turn of the century, Europe had a decade to integrate, which they did. So the European economy began to take off. And now, even though Japan was still in the doldrums, now everyone was talking about China. So, and then, of course, the BRICS. So now you had demand driven for the first time since the advent of the global hydrocarbon economy, where you had demand growth all around the globe. And when you had 20 years of underinvestment exploration, of course you did not have oil. But it wasn't because we were running out of oil. We just stopped looking for it. But as the term goes in economics, high prices are the cure for high prices. And we spent the better part of 2010 with those high prices then what do? We come up with technologies. Yes, we spurred back demand, but this was this what led us to the growth in shale production. Of course, up until the 1990s, we already knew about the Bakken Reserve, that there was more oil underneath the Saskatchewan Plain in Canada and in the Dakotas in the United States than there was or there is on the entire Arabian Peninsula. But with its formation, it was never economically sound to get that oil out of that. Now, of course, you drive prices to 120, 30, 40, $150 a barrel. All of a sudden, it's economical to go and access that oil, which is what we did. So that put a lot of oil onto the market. And so all of a sudden, that fallacy of peak oil, and now we're all talking about, to your question, peak demand. And while, yes, here in the United States, we're trying to codify, we're trying to legislate out fossil fuel demand. And perhaps we get there, it's the wrong thing to do, because we're going to go back to an environment where we're going to underinvest. And within the next generation, 2 generations, there'll still be demand for fossil fuel, for oil here in the United States. But the United States is no longer the demand driver for oil. Of course, we have China and we have India. It's a couple of billion people there, a significant fraction of the Earth's population, where demand is just now really starting to grow. So no, I don't see demand peaking anytime into the future. While yes, here in the West, we try to legislate it out, but as I said, all that's going to do is lead to less supply coming to the market, where you have demand in the 2 largest countries in the world continuing to grow, which will continue to support prices.
Yeah, thank you for that answer.
I'm going to pick up on that because I think Stephen's obviously done quite a bit of research on this. Where do you see oil demand per year going? What type of growth are you projecting, Stephen? 5, 10% growth of oil demand going forward, or what's your thoughts on that?
I think on an average, kind of in a geometric, if I were to forecast prices, which I have done out to 2040, and we kind of take a geometric mean of that year over year growth, right now I'm coming into about 1.5 to 2% per year over the long run. Now that will be kind of front loaded, where we'll see greater growth going into the end of this decade and then kind of tapering off as China and India come up and reach their max demand. But the demand will still be there, and I can see growth occurring out through and beyond 2040.
Okay, so like an average of 1% growth on an annual basis. Okay.
In the long run, yes.
Yep, got it. Okay, so staying with your expertise, because obviously when you're looking at oil and gas, natural gas pricing, you got to look at fundamentals, and certainly the economy is a big part of it. And you know, I actually got this question for some staff members who actually heard you speak at some sessions, and I think it was with BP, to be clear. And I think they were suggesting, oh, you got to ask Stephen about the status of the economy and possibly recession indicators. Yeah. So what's your thoughts on sort of the status of recession or possible recession or in the future, per se?
I'm perplexed because there are plenty of recession indicators that are screaming recession. Now, we can make an argument 2 years ago because we had back-to-back negative GDP, which has always been a non-official indicator of recession. Now, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the people that are in charge of designating recessions, said, oh, no, this isn't a recession. I don't know what the reasonings were, but it was very odd because of the 14 odd recessions that we've had since the post-World War II economic downturn after the war economy in the late 1940s and going up through the Great Recession. Each one of those, I believe it was 14 recessions, but every single recession was always defined by back-to-back quarters of negative growth. And we had it again this year or 2 years ago. And for whatever reason, we weren't in recession. So that said, I'm still skeptical. I'm still concerned about economic growth, but I am impressed and I am pleasantly surprised, of course, because we all want to do well in a growing economy, that we haven't seen it yet. And so why haven't we seen it? Or more importantly, what are those recession indicators that I'm talking about? So the New York Federal Reserve did a study, and and it's been all over the media, the inversion of the yield curve, two-year to 10-year, and so forth. But as far as the Federal Reserve Bank goes, according to their studies conducted by the New York Fed, the 3-month, 10-year yield curve is a great recession indicator. And this is the curve that the Fed is watching. So when we look at that inversion now it has been inverted for a record 12 consecutive months. So now, of course, there's the correlation causation factor that we have to come into. And there is correlation there because we have seen this inversion in this particular spread in every recession since the double dip recession in the early 1980s. But timing is everything. So whereas, yes, we've seen these inversions, it doesn't mean, we're going right into recession. It's just been a precursor of recession. What I'm more concerned about is because we have the reason why yields are getting crushed. But my biggest concern is of debt. Now, the U.S. consumer spending, as I said in the previous podcast, is 70% of the U.S. economy. Now, we've already drained all of the money, the trillions of dollars that the government has printed to inject into consumers' pockets. All of that money has been spent. Our savings have been completely depleted. So in the aggregate, our savings are at dangerously low levels. But we always have to keep up with the Joneses. So whereas our savings are low, of course, inflation has eaten into our paychecks. So we continually, month in, month out, we're earning less adjusted for inflation. So what do? We turn to the plastic. We go to our credit cards. And what we see now is household debt, overall debt is at record levels. When we just kind of factor out credit card debt, we're now at, I think we've gone through 18 maybe months of month over month record credit card debt, where credit card debt now is well over $1 trillion, about $5,700 for every cardholder in the United States. And if you hold and you do not pay off that credit card debt every month, then you are paying in excess of 22% on that debt. I mean, at this point, instead of going to a bank, you're better off going to the mafia because you'd probably get better interest rates there. So that is the concern of consumer spending. That shoe hasn't dropped, and there's no telling when or even if it will drop. But certainly it has to be, and has to be on everyone's radar. It certainly is on my radar. So that is an absolute huge burden for all of us to incur if you are. So that is, I think, that and the yield curve inversion on the Fed's favorite spread are two indicators that I think that will eventually lead to a downturn in economic activity. And of course, the antecedent to that would be inflation. So not only inflation in gasoline prices, but it's inflation in natural gas prices, in all energy prices, which then has the knock-on to inflation at the grocery counter. And that has been when we had that downturn in oil prices in the latter half of last year, that was offset by record inflation in certain categories at the grocery counter. And I just want to point out where we all have this war, or certain people in government have this war on natural gas, we have to keep in mind that a war on natural gas is a war on food. Natural gas is a key feedstock that goes into the production of ammonia nitrate, i.e. fertilizer. So we already saw it last year with fertilizer costs that just went, not just here in the United States, but all around the globe, that just skyrocketed. So, of course, this all has an impact. And that impact was that farmers planted more soybeans last year than corn. The soybeans require far less fertilizer than corn. And at the same time, we had the Republican senators out of the Corn Belt and the Democratic administration. So those two strange fellows getting into bed, increasing demand for corn and increasing in the form of higher ethanol mandates. So what we did was we pushed demand from corn off of the grocery table into our garage. And therefore, that led to higher prices for the counter. And so that higher inflation, as I said before, it eats into our paychecks, which then pushes some of us into taking on more and more debt. And eventually, I think that there's going to have to be an end to that, and that end will be recession. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm still concerned that those telltales are out there.
So staying with that, I was reading a national publication here in Canada. So in the U.S., my understanding is you typically have 30-year mortgages type of thing. In Canada, that's not the case. It tends to be 5 years. So, and there's thinking that next year with the renewal of mortgages, that effectively a lot of people are going to be negatively impacted because their interest rates are going to be skyrocket, maybe twice what it was initially. So the pain will occur certainly, or could occur here in the, and I think that is still an issue. It doesn't matter what side of the border. I think that's an issue that we all have to contend with. So certainly this is something we're going to have to face. And summary, and again, I'm not wishing this, but with the idea of this pain, do you see it dramatically impacting the natural gas or oil market? I mean, you've talked about it before, but do you think it has any bear to the pricing because of this recession?
Yeah, I think that the bigger impact than an economic downturn in the housing market, the biggest concern is our war on natural gas, where new residential hookups, you're not allowed to.
Yes.
That's so I have one of my children lives in Boston, and in the Brookline suburb and in the city of Boston, new residents, you can't have a natural gas hookup. We're seeing it. I have another daughter that was going to school in Northern California, and new residents cannot, I think it was at the start of this year, cannot have hookups to natural gas. So while we have this war on, and we're trying to control our demand, well, of course, the knock-on is going to be the potential of production. As we think we can legislate out this demand for natural gas, of course, the knock-on is going to be on the supply of natural gas. So why am I going to sell natural gas into a domestic market where my government is telling me I can't use it? That's just going to give me more of an incentive to take that gas out of this market and get it abroad.
Yes.
So that the supply knock-on will have a tremendous impact over the next 7-10 years. Then, of course, the more supply we take out of the domestic market, the higher those prices will lead into. And of course, as we take out natural gas, we have renewables, which the Pollyannas think, oh, that's going to replace natural gas. But the renewables are nowhere near ready for prime time at this point.
I want to move us on to talking about the oil and gas sector and I've got a two-part question. Part of it touches on what you said earlier. Where I'm going on that is, are there financing pressures that are impacting the oil and gas sector? That's part one of the question. And the second part, which I'm sure you will enjoy, is, are the new disclosure regulations creating issues for the oil and gas sector?
Yes. As far as the financing goes, obviously with interest rates going where they are, it's not just credit cards and mortgages, of course, it's across the board. So it is more expensive to finance new projects. And finance new projects, the saying in finance is capital goes where it's welcomed and stays where it's well treated. And there's no secret that this has been the first White House that's ever been openly hostile to the fossil fuel industry. So now we're talking about making investments in a high interest rate environment into an unfriendly government. And if that government, if that presidency continues through next term, then we're talking 5 more years of an unfriendly environment, which does not bode well for financing and then therefore built out in fossil fuel infrastructure. Anecdotally, a number of the clients I have in the oil patch, be they in the Canadian or in the central U.S. oil patch, have been warned and have been told by their banks that you're going to we'll finance you for the next 2 years, but you're going to be weaned off. And it's only going to be the majors. So you're going to see greater consolidation, but the financing is certainly an issue where not only you have high interest rates, but your access to capital is going to be limited just to the super majors. So that is generally an obvious concern going forward as it relates to supply. As far as the new disclosures, yes, that's also because that's raising the cost. The more disclosure, my corporate counsel does very well. The outside lawyers do very well. Your administrators are taxed and again, that's another increased cost of getting BTUs out of the ground. And so eventually that cost will have to and will get passed on to us, the people who buy that. So you have kind of a trident, as it were, of higher interest rates, unfriendly governments, and I just forgot what I just said, but those demand drivers of a lack of access. There you go, lack of access to capital. So that all contributes to squeezing supply, which of course obviously pushes the P or price along the y-axis higher, i.e. higher prices.
Yeah, I think that's going to lead really nicely into David's next question.
So, Stephen, this is the last question, but this is a juicy one because I'm really looking forward to hear your thoughts on this. So, if you were to advise the American government, what policy recommendations would you have for them to support the energy transition? Now, you're welcome to say you wouldn't support an energy transition as well. You've got free will on this, so please let it rip.
Yes, well, I do support energy transition. As I said before, I do drive a plug-in electric hybrid, and I think that's the best of both worlds. I believe the Japanese are not going all in or at all on EVs, they think. And I'm not going to argue against the Japanese car makers. They are the premium out there in the market. They're betting on continuation and growth in electric plug-in hybrids. So my policy recommendation is stop the EV or renewable BS, or the zero-sum game, I should say, in this, because renewables are not going to be ready. Governor Newsom in California mandating that maybe 2030 or 2035, all new cars have to be EV. Okay, that's great. California can't keep the lights on today. I'm spending time in California today. I've gone on Turo. I've rented Teslas. I love the darn things. I mean, they are a blast to drive. But the problem is the hotel I'm staying at, and actually I'm in Airbnb right now, they don't have the facility to charge that Tesla. So then I have to go to a public charging station. And there's always at least a 30-minute wait to get into that charging station. And then, of course, I have to spend another 45 minutes to fill that car up. Now, before anyone gets their knickers in a twist here, because I have given this statistic out or this anecdote out, and I'm told, Stephen, you have to use apps, to find out where the nearest open Tesla station is. And yes, I am a technical troglodyte, but even I know there's an app out there to tell me, and I do use it. And guess what? I'm not the only one using it. So by the time I get there, it's jam-packed. So California does not have the infrastructure. California is on the forefront, and if they don't have the infrastructure, no one has the infrastructure. So there has to be so my recommendation is there has to be stop the zero sum because we're not ready for it. And this is, okay, you might call me, I'm a fossil fuel guy, I'm an ideologue, but as I said, I practice what I preach. I am driving a plug-in. Believe it or not, I want my children, I want my grandchildren to inherit a greener earth than I was born into. That's all good for everyone. But we're going about it the absolute wrong way. And so while you can discount what I'm saying, what you cannot discount is the other people who are saying it. For instance, the Nuclear Energy Regulatory Committee, the FERC, the Regional Transmission Organization, which aggregates electricity distribution through the Mid-Atlantic out into the Midwest. They are saying in all statements that we are not able to meet the renewable mandates that the government has codified. That is to say, we've been ordered to take X amount of fossil fuel generation out dispatchable generation, so a nuke and natural gas price that could run 24 hours a day, or coal. We have to take that dispatchable BTUs or electricity out of the market, and we have to replace it by renewables. Now, renewables are great, right? When it's sunny, those photons can make it to the panels, or when it's windy, but not too windy, right? Because we need at least winds of 7 miles an hour to get those turbines running, but it can't exceed 55 miles an hour because it burns, you'll blow out the gearbox. So we need very strict parameters for wind, very strict parameters for solar. So that's not dispatchable distribution of energy, but this is what we must replace it with. So not only are we ordered to switch from dispatchable to non-dispatchable generation, but even that generation is not ready. So, and that's not me saying, that's the people who know, the people who are in charge of distributing this power. They're telling the government it cannot and will not be done. And what is the government's response to this, Ben? It's to hide their head and bury it in the sand and say to the market, well, this is so important, it has to get done, as if the industry could just take some magic pixie dust, spread it across the industry, and boom, we'll have all these renewables. This is the government's official stance. I'll give you for instance. Back in February, we had, I don't want to mention the gentleman's name, but he is a high-ranking official in New York State government, a conservation overlooking the transition. And when asked in a presentation that he gave about these concerns that are being expressed by the industry regulators, that we cannot meet the goals because we're codifying taking the dispatchable generation off, but we can't meet it with renewables, part of because it's too aggressive, the goals set forth. And let us not forget, there is a NIMBY crowd, not just with the natural gas pipeline, but with people who do not want a windmill off the coast of New Jersey. Ted Kennedy did not want it off the coast of Hyannisport because that's where, quote unquote, he sailed. So there is going to be that pushback for even the renewable projects that people don't want it in their backyard. That's just another hurdle that the industry will have to face and will prolong our transition to a full renewable economy, which again is not feasible and not practical and not attainable. But going back to this New York State representative, when asked and posed with this question, his response was, "We do not have a plan B." That's a near verbatim quote. We do not have a plan B because in his estimation, which obviously he's not an economist, he's obviously not an engineer, he's probably a typical government stooge, i.e. a lawyer, who knows nothing about technicals, who is just saying, oh, this is so important, it has to get done. And if it doesn't get done, well, we don't have an option. We don't have a plan B. So guys, you better get it done. And they're telling them it's not going to happen. So we have to get away from the zero-sum game. And solar here in Southern California or in the Southwest makes a whole lot of sense. There's a lot of sun in Southern California, not so much in middle and Northern California, but a lot here. And it does have a positive impact on power prices. You typically get your lowest power prices on an hourly basis in the late afternoon when it's the hottest, because that's when the sun is burning the most. Prices will tend to move higher in the evening hours because that's when the solar goes down. There go your dispatchable, and you have to bring on your dispatchable, your natural gas, and that's when prices will get an uptick. But now if we don't have that natural gas to fall back on, and we're relying on solar and the holy grail, of course, is storage, battery, which we're not there, then you're leading to more chaos. So if we had that integration of both solar, we have wind in PG&E in Northern California, but as I said before, when those Santa Anas blow, those winds, and we're getting sustained winds above 55 miles an hour, you're not getting any wind power because those windmills, yes, have to shut down because the wind is blowing too fast. So that is part of the solution. Wind in Texas and through the entire central United States, wind makes a lot of sense to be an add-on to fossil fuel generation. Now, I'm not advocating bringing coal back as a driver, but you have to have natural gas. Economically, from a physics standpoint, when we look at the amount of energy that we're getting from solar, from wind, it cannot be replaced. Going back to California, they're going to have to increase their capacity by 70% just to meet the 35 million cars in California that are registered in California. And as I said, California doesn't keep the lights on now. What happens when you put all that extra demand on the market and you're not going to get enough generation to the market? So if we had a more reasoned, where it's a grab bag where Solar works in Southern California. It doesn't really work in Oregon, but you have hydro in Oregon and Washington State. That works great, but doesn't necessarily work great in the Carolinas or in the Southeast, where you have significant amount of, let me say it, nuclear. So nuclear would be my ultimate dream, would be that we would have to have nuclear to really ensure a cleaner, more renewable transition. Now, I don't ever see that happening in my lifetime, but I'm not, of course, the only one talking about this. That is, to a lot of people, that is the obvious answer. Now, of course, you're going to get pushed back by Jane Fonda and Jackson Brown. So we're just going to have to wait for that generation to kind of, die. And then, maybe we can, talk about that. But again, that's not going to happen in my lifetime. But the bottom line is stop this game of zero sum. It's not attainable. It's not wise. And we'd be much better off if we had a mix of a compromise, a bipartisan, as it were, political standpoint, where we accentuate renewables where they work the best, and we accentuate fossil fuel, again, gas or nuke, where that works the best.
Fair enough. And let me just, if I could, is it possible that markets would take care and direct the best solutions? Would markets be able to do this versus government policy?
Yeah, well, that's kind of like, that answers the question, because there is no such thing. As much as you probably don't know it. So I'll tell you, I'm kind of a right of center guy. So I know that's coming as a surprise.
That did not come. That wasn't that obvious to us, probably.
Right. So I am a capitalist. I do believe in market economies. Unfortunately, there's nothing really. There's no a free economy out there. So there's always going to be an economy that is impacted by government regulation. So if we took the regulation out, or you can't take the regulation out. We need regulation, because people, be they in the government or in private industry, there's a greed factor out there. There's a human nature out there. So you need strict regulation, especially if we pursue the nuclear holy grail. There is that regulation that is required. It just seems that we've over-regulated the market. We've given the lawyers too much, where they'll fight the expansion of a natural gas pipeline. For instance, going into Massachusetts on the Algonquin pipeline, which is at max capacity. So on a cold winter or an extremely hot summer in New England, you can't get enough BTU, enough gas there. So you have to go to Canada, or you have to go to offshore Sabine, or Sable, to get that LNG into Everett, into the Boston market. Now, that's okay during maybe the summer. But now in the winter, you're competing with Quebec. You're competing with heating demand in Eastern Canada. So electricity prices always skyrocket on extremely cold or extremely hot days. So yes, the markets, if they were regulated in a feasible, if there was, again, a working relationship between government and industry, as opposed to this hostile approach between the two, where they're both looking out for their own purposes and their own reasons. We could argue about what those reasons are, but that's the pursuit now. But if we had, again, a more integrated policy where you have to have strict regulation, safety protocols with the construction of BTUs, but you have to let the market kind of move in. And I said, why did oil prices go from $150 a barrel to below $50 a barrel? Well, part of that was the economic downturn, but when the economy started to come back after the Great Recession, you still had oil prices that were contained within a range. And that was because we let the industry, the government let the industry go, and hence where I'm going with this is the shale gale, to the point where 2.5 years ago, the United States was energy independent for all intents and purposes. Yes, we still import crude oil, but you know what? We export a lot of crude oil. And the crude oil we export is a very high quality crude oil, because our refineries are engineered. Our refineries here in the United States are the most sophisticated in the world, capable of burning a dirtier, heavier crude oil, which takes a lot more engineering. And therefore, because these are lesser grade oils, they're cheaper. So we are importing cheap oil. We're importing tuna fish and we're exporting caviar or high quality oil. But for all intents and purposes, the United States was the dominant player in the global crude oil market. Of course, that has changed over the past 2.5 years. There's apparently we want to go to according to our current government leadership, despots in Saudi Arabia, despots in Venezuela, to encourage them to bring more oil. So what we're doing now is we're discouraging the production of high quality, cleaner, not clean, but cleaner oil here in the United States. And we're going to Venezuela, which produces sludge, which is the dirtiest crude oil in the world. But somehow that's better for the environment than the oil being produced here. So if we allow the markets to perform, then that dirty Venezuelan oil would never get to the market. And the oil that we have now, and then, of course, the investment in other technologies to make that oil either cleaner or invest in more feasible renewables would grow. And just in closing, my biggest concern is that we're such on this mantra of EVs, as if that's the answer. Now, remember, you got to burn something to get those electrons into your car. And the concern is, one, the feasibility, the physics of it all, because the physics is already dictating solar technology and wind technology, mainly solar technology. There's just so much more energy you're going to be able to get without another breakthrough in technology. There is the social impact, of course, because remember, where we're getting our rare earth metals today, i.e. Central Africa and China, those two areas of the world don't have the greatest record when it comes to human rights. So whether you're an Uyghur Muslim slave humping rocks in China or a kid in the Congo humping rocks, you're putting them in severe situations just to make you feel better that you think you're doing something good for the environment, which in general you're not, because when we think about the rare earth metals, the heavy metals that are now seeping in to the dumps in California, because California is already at its initial wave, 20-year wave of solar panels, which now are in the process of being replenished. Solar panels now being discarded. California never had a plan to discard these solar panels, so they're sitting there, and the heavy metals. The potential is that they begin to, of course, seep into the soil and eventually make it to an aquifer, or the non-recyclable plastic that goes into manufacturing of windmills are just sitting there. So we're adding more and more, and we think we're doing something better. And then, of course, there's the economic impact. And so what we're doing is, what we've done is in economics, the term is rent seeking. We're telling the market you have to go to a certain renewable. So that's brought a lot of players into the market who are making money by seeking rent. That is to say, they're not making the processes more efficient. They're not earning their money off of the market, off of the economies of scale, something they've created. They're earning it by the kickbacks that the government is giving the industry. That's where their economic drivers are. And that is because the government has decided it thinks it's picked a winner. And the markets pick winners. The government doesn't pick winners. So the more we mandate a certain technology in renewables, that is less investment, less incentive to go into other avenues, maybe green hydrogen, maybe it's algae, so forth. So again, we need more working relationship between government and industry.
Thank you for that.
Well, on that note, thank you again, Stephen, for joining us this week.
Good to be here.
Thank you, Stephen. And happy travels. We'll look forward to touch base next year to see where you're located.
All right.
Very good, sir.
Have a great week. That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts.